Welcome, gentle soul, to Olympus Dreams. Here, where myth whispers through the shadows and ancient voices sing of heroes long departed, we gather stories that have survived the turning of ages. If these tales bring you peace, a quiet like or subscription helps others find their rest too. Now, let us drift back through centuries uncounted to a wedding feast where fate first cast its die, to the moment when the greatest warrior's story began, not with bronze or blood, but with a golden apple and a mother's love. On the slopes of Mount Pelion, where pine forests climbed toward starlit peaks, the gods themselves descended for a wedding. The air shimmered with their presence, thick as honey with divine radiance. Peleus, king of the Myrmidons, a mortal man whose courage had earned him immortal favor, was to wed Thetis, loveliest of the sea nymphs, daughter of ancient Nereus, who knew all the ocean's secrets. It was a match both blessed and troubled. Thetis had once been desired by Zeus himself, until Prometheus whispered a dangerous prophecy: any son born to Thetis would surpass his father in greatness. Zeus, remembering how he had overthrown his own father Kronos, felt the cold finger of fate trace his spine. Better, he decided, to give Thetis to a mortal king. A son might surpass Peleus without threatening heaven's throne. The wedding pavilion stood wreathed in flowers that bloomed only in divine gardens. White columns caught the moonlight and threw it back like captured silver. Tables groaned beneath the weight of ambrosia and nectar, foods that mortals could not eat without burning from within. The wine ran dark as storms, and its scent carried hints of summer lightning. The gods arrived in splendor. Zeus, cloud-gathering king of heaven, his beard threaded with silver fire. Hera at his side, regal and watchful, her eyes missing nothing. Athena came bearing gifts of wisdom, her grey eyes calm as winter seas. Poseidon brought pearls still wet from ocean depths. Apollo arrived with his lyre, and the music he played made the stars lean closer to listen. They danced beneath those stars, gods and nymphs, and favored mortals, their feet barely touching ground that trembled with their presence. The night air filled with laughter that sounded like distant bells. Thetis moved among them, graceful as wave motion, her hair catching light like foam on midnight waters. She smiled, but those who knew her well saw something else behind her eyes. A shadow, a knowing. Only one goddess had not been invited to this celebration, Eris, spirit of discord and strife, whose presence turned feasts into battlefields and friends into enemies. The other gods had agreed, better to leave her in whatever dark corner she inhabited than risk her particular gift for chaos. But Eris came anyway. She did not announce herself with thunder or flame. She simply appeared at the edge of the celebration, a figure in tattered grey, smiling, a smile that held neither warmth nor malice, only inevitability. In her hand she carried a single apple, golden as captured sunlight, perfect in every curve and surface. The music faltered. Conversations died like candles in wind. Eris walked forward slowly, savoring the silence that preceded her. When she reached the center of the pavilion, she held up the apple so all could see. Upon its skin, words had been carved in letters that seemed to shift and dance, for the fairest. Then she tossed it carelessly into the midst of the gathered goddesses and vanished like smoke from a dying fire. The apple rolled across marble floors, coming to rest at the feet of three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, who had arrived late, wrapped in desire's shimmering veil. Each looked at the others. Each reached toward the apple. Each stopped. "It is mine," Hera said quietly with the certainty of queens. "I am Zeus's wife, mother of gods." "Beauty is more than station," Athena replied, her voice cool as spring water. "Wisdom wears the truest crown." Aphrodite said nothing at all. She merely smiled, and that smile made Hero's heart stop, made wise men forget their own names. The apple seemed to glow brighter in her presence, as if recognizing its rightful owner. Zeus, who had faced titans and monsters without flinching, looked upon these three and felt something close to fear. Whatever choice he made, whichever goddess he favored, the other two would become his eternal enemies. And so, being Zeus, he chose not to choose. "Let Paris of Troy be the judge," he said, naming a shepherd prince far away, too distant to matter, or so the king of gods believed. But seeds had been planted. Troy's fate, though none yet knew it, was sealed by this golden apple and the judgment it demanded. The wedding feast continued, but something had changed. The music sounded hollow now. The laughter rang false. One by one, the gods departed, slipping away like dreams at dawn. Only the bride and groom remained, standing together as the last torches guttered and failed. Pelias took his bride's hand. It was cool, like sea-smoothed stone. "What troubles you?" he asked, for he loved her, and love notices shadows others miss. Thetis looked toward the east, where dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "I have heard prophecies," she said softly. "I have dreamed. Dreams that taste of salt and iron. Tell me." She turned to him then, and her eyes held depths no mortal gaze could fathom. "We will have a son," she said. "A son more glorious than any warrior who has walked beneath the sun. His name will echo through ages uncounted. Songs will carry his deeds across centuries." Pelias smiled, for what father would not wish such glory for his son? But Thetis was not finished. "His life will be brief," she whispered. "Bright as summer lightning, and as quickly gone. He will be given a choice, a long life of peace and obscurity, forgotten before his grandchildren's children are born, or a short life of such blazing glory that men will speak his name with reverence until the stars themselves grow cold." The smile faded from Pelias's face. "And which will he choose?" "I know my son already," Thetis said, though the child was not yet born, not yet even conceived. "I know his heart. He will choose glory. He will choose the short path, the bright burning." Her voice broke just slightly. "And I, who am immortal, will watch my mortal son die, and know that my blood in his veins was not enough to save him." Pelias held her as the sun rose fully, painting Mount Pelion in gold that was nothing like the cursed apple, nothing like the glitter of coming war. They stood together in the morning light, mortal and immortal, bound by love and separated by the cruel mathematics of fate. Far to the south, in a city of tall towers and strong walls, a shepherd prince named Paris was tending his flocks, unaware that three goddesses would soon appear before him, each offering bribes beyond imagination, each demanding he choose who was fairest. Unaware that his choice would light a fire that would burn for 10 years and consume the greatest heroes of the age. And farther still, in the darkness where unborn souls wait for flesh and breath, a spirit stirred. A child not yet conceived, but already known to prophecy. A son who would be called Achilles, swift-footed, godlike, terrible and beautiful in equal measure. The wedding was over. The guests had departed. But the story, the great and terrible story, was only beginning. The sea cave where Thetis made her home was carved from black volcanic rock, its entrance hidden beneath overhanging cliffs where seabirds nested in the crevices. Inside, the walls wept with moisture, and pools of seawater reflected light that filtered down through cracks in the stone ceiling. The air tasted of salt and something older, something that predated even the gods who now ruled from Olympus. Here, 9 months after the wedding on Mount Pelion, Achilles was born. The birth came at night, during a storm that turned the sea to chaos. Waves crashed against the rocks outside with voices like angry titans. Lightning split the sky in jagged white scars. Inside the cave, Thetis labored alone, as she had requested. Some mysteries belonged only to mothers and the dark. When the child finally emerged into the world, his cry was not the mewling of ordinary infants. It rang out clear and sharp, echoing off the cave walls, carrying somehow above the storm's fury. In that sound, those who knew how to listen might have heard bronze on bronze, the clash of shields, the songs men sing before battle. Pelias arrived at dawn, when the storm had passed and the sea lay exhausted, gentle as breathing. He found his wife sitting on smooth stone, the child wrapped in sea-green cloth, her face carved from exhaustion and wonder in equal measure. The infant's eyes were open, impossibly alert for one so newly arrived. They were grey as winter seas, and already they seemed to see too much. The name meant lipless in their tongue, for she had not kissed him at birth, holding herself apart, knowing already what loving him would cost. Pelias reached for his son. The child's grip, when tiny fingers closed around his father's thumb, was surprisingly strong. Already, even in this fragile newborn form, something extraordinary lived in him. His hair, what little he had, gleamed gold in the morning light filtering through the cave entrance. For a time they remained there together, the three of them, suspended in the peaceful moment between prophecy and its fulfillment. Outside, waves lapped gently at the rocks. Seabirds called to one another, their voices plaintive and sweet. The world continued its turning, unaware that it had just received a child who would shake its foundations. But Thetis could not forget. Each time she looked at her son, she saw not just the infant in her arms, but the shadow of the man he would become. The warrior. The brief, bright flame that would burn so intensely before guttering out. Mortal. Her son was mortal, cursed with his father's death, marked blood, and all her divine nature could not change that simple, terrible fact. An idea came to her in the depths of that first night, while Pelias slept, and she sat wakeful, watching the child breathe. If she could not change his mortal nature entirely, perhaps she could strengthen it. Perhaps she could weave invulnerability into his flesh, the way other mothers wove wool into cloth. She knew the place. The river Styx, the boundary between living and dead, the oath by which even gods swore their most binding promises. Its waters held power older than Olympus, older than the Titans, old as the first separation between existence and void. What those waters touched could not be harmed by mortal weapons. She did not tell Pelias. Some decisions mothers must make alone. 3 nights after the birth, when the moon was dark and her husband slept deeply, Thetis rose. She wrapped Achilles in her arms, and together they left the cave. She walked inland, following paths only she could see, through forests where ancient trees grew so close their branches wove into living tunnels. The forest floor was soft with centuries of fallen needles. Somewhere distant, an owl called. The entrance to the underworld lay hidden in a grove of black poplars where even at midday shadows pooled thick as oil. Here the barrier between worlds wore thin. Thetis descended, sure-footed in the darkness, following the sound of rushing water. The river Styx flowed swift and cold, its waters black as starless night. Mist rose from its surface, carrying whispers of the dead, fragments of prayers never answered, memories of those who had crossed and could never return. The sound it made was less like water than like wind through empty rooms, through abandoned temples, through the spaces where life used to be. Thetis stood on its bank, holding her son close. He did not cry. Even then, at mere days old, Achilles seemed to understand that silence was required in this place. She knelt at the water's edge. The coldness radiating from the river made her divine flesh ache. She unwrapped the child, and in the dim light that had no visible source, his skin seemed to glow faintly, warmly, impossibly alive in this realm of endings. "Forgive me," she whispered to him. "Forgive me for what I am about to do, and for what I am about to fail to do." She gripped his right heel firmly, her fingers pressing into the tender flesh. Then, holding him suspended above the water by that single point of contact, she lowered him into the Styx. The water hissed where it touched divine skin. Steam rose, smelling of iron and endings. Achilles drew breath to scream, but the sound died in his throat, swallowed by the river's ancient power. His small body went rigid, every muscle locked, as the Styx worked its transformation. Thetis counted heartbeats. 20. 30. Long enough for the magic to take hold, not so long that the river would claim him entirely. Then she pulled him free, lifting him into the air where he hung from her grip, water streaming from his limbs. She wrapped him quickly in dry cloth, holding him against her heart. His skin, where the water had touched, was unmarked, unchanged to the eye, but she could feel the difference, a hardness beneath the softness. Flesh that would turn aside iron and bronze, that would make him proof against the weapons of men, all except the heel where her fingers had gripped. That small spot remained untouched by the Styx's power, as vulnerable as any mortal skin. She had tried to make him invincible. Instead, she had given him one perfect weakness. The journey back through the forest was slower. Dawn was breaking as she reached the sea cave, painting the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. She laid Achilles in his cradle, a basket woven from reeds that grew only in sacred springs. The child slept now, deeply, peacefully, his breathing steady as tide. Pelias stirred, waking to find her sitting beside their son, one hand resting on the cradle's edge. "Where did you go?" he asked sleepily. "Nowhere," Thetis said, which was not quite a lie. The underworld was not a place but an unplace, a negation of geography. "I walked. I needed to think." He accepted this, as mortals often accept what their divine spouses tell them, having learned that some questions lead to answers that bring no comfort. He rose and came to stand beside her, looking down at their sleeping son. "He will be remarkable," Pelias said softly. "Yes," Thetis agreed, her voice carrying harmonics of sorrow he could not quite hear. "We will raise him well. Teach him honor. Show him how to be worthy of the gifts he has been given." "Yes." Pelias kissed her forehead and left to prepare the morning fire. Alone with her son, Thetis allowed herself one moment of weakness. She lifted Achilles from his cradle, held him close, and let silent tears fall onto his golden hair. They were the last tears she would shed for him, though her sorrow would never diminish. Outside the cave, morning light spread across the water, turning it silver and gold. Somewhere far away, in Troy's high towers, a child named Paris was growing, learning to string a bow, dreaming dreams of glory he did not yet understand. And, farther still, in Sparta, a girl named Helen was learning to walk, already beautiful enough to make poets abandon their words in helpless worship. All the pieces were moving into position. The game was not yet begun, but the board was being set. And in a sea cave where waves whispered lullabies older than language, Achilles slept, invulnerable and vulnerable in equal measure, already marked by fate, though his life had barely started. The years that followed unfolded with deceptive gentleness. Spring turned to summer, turned to autumn in the rhythm mortals knew, and Achilles grew as mortal children grow, yet not quite the same. He walked earlier than other infants, ran before he should have been able, and spoke in complete sentences while barely past his second year. His golden hair grew long and wild, catching sunlight like captured fire. Pelias watched his son with growing unease, the kind fathers feel when they recognize that what they have made is beyond their capacity to shape. The boy was too quick, too bright, too strong. At 3 years old, he could outrun boys twice his age. At 4, he demanded a sword and wept with frustration when refused. At 5, he caught a deer in the forest behind the palace with nothing but his bare hands and brought it home alive, cradled in his arms like a pet. Thetis watched too from greater distance. She came and went with the tides, present and absent in patterns that followed no mortal calendar. Sometimes Achilles would wake to find her sitting beside his bed, singing songs in languages that had no names. Other times, months would pass with no sign of her, except the perfect shells that appeared on his windowsill, each one holding the sound of her voice if he pressed it to his ear. When Achilles was 6 years old, Peleus made the decision that he hoped would save his son from something he could not name but deeply feared. He summoned his advisors, consulted oracles, and finally sent messages across the mountains to the one being he trusted to shape a hero without breaking him. The reply came carved on a piece of driftwood, written in letters that seemed to shift and breathe. "Send him when he is ready. I will be waiting." On the morning of his 7th birthday, Achilles stood in the courtyard of his father's palace, dressed in a simple tunic, carrying nothing but a small bundle of clothes and a wooden practice sword his father had commissioned. The real weapons would come later, if Chiron deemed him worthy. Peleus knelt before his son eye to eye and spoke the words he had been rehearsing for weeks. "You are going to Mount Pelion to study with the wisest teacher in all of Greece. Chiron will teach you everything you need to know. How to hunt, how to fight, how to heal wounds and honor gods. But most importantly, he will teach you how to be more than just strong." Achilles looked at his father with those strange, seeing eyes. "Will Mother be there?" "Sometimes, perhaps. But this is your journey, not hers." The boy nodded solemnly, already understanding more than he should. They embraced, and Peleus held his son longer than necessary, memorizing the feel of small arms around his neck, the scent of childhood still clinging to golden hair. Then servants led Achilles to a cart drawn by mountain ponies, and the journey began. Mount Pelion rose from the coastal plains like a promise, its peaks lost in clouds even on clear days. The road climbed through olive groves and vineyards, past small villages where children stopped their play to stare at the cart passing by. Something about the golden-haired boy drew their eyes, though they could not have said why. Higher still, the cultivated lands gave way to wilderness. Oak forests thick with shadow, streams that ran clear and cold, meadows carpeted with wildflowers whose names existed only in the memories of bees. The air grew thinner, sharper, tasting of pine and stone and distance. They reached Chiron's dwelling as the sun touched the western peaks. It was not a palace or even a proper house, but rather a wide cave mouth hung with woven curtains that moved in the evening breeze. Before the entrance, a fire burned in a stone ring, and beside it stood the centaur. Chiron was ancient, though his body showed no signs of age. His human torso rose from the body of a white horse, his shoulders broad and strong, his face lined with wisdom that predated the Olympians. His eyes, when they turned to regard the approaching cart, held the patience of mountains. The servants helped Achilles down from the cart, then departed quickly, as if afraid to linger too long in this place between mortal and divine. The boy stood alone before the centaur, small and uncertain, yet refusing to show fear. "You are Achilles," Chiron said. His voice was like wind through caves, ancient and certain. "Do you know why you are here?" The boy considered this carefully. "My father says you will teach me to be a hero. Your father is partly correct." Chiron moved closer, his hooves making no sound on the grass. "I will teach you many things. But whether you become a hero is not my choice to make. That will be yours, and yours alone." He gestured toward the cave. "Come. You must be hungry, and night falls quickly on the mountain." Thus began an education unlike any other given to mortal or demigod. Chiron's cave, which seemed small from outside, opened into chambers that went deep into the mountain's heart. One room held scrolls and tablets containing all the knowledge of the ancient world. Another served as an infirmary, where dried herbs hung from the ceiling and the air smelled of healing. A third was empty except for a lyre carved from wood, so old it had turned to stone, yet still produced music when touched by knowing hands. Achilles learned as plants learn sunlight, instinctively and without resistance. Chiron taught him to hunt, to move through forests like wind through leaves, to understand the language of animal tracks and broken branches. They tracked deer through morning mist, wolves through evening shadows, and once a great boar that led them to a spring where the water tasted of starlight. He learned to fight with spear and sword, but also with words, with silence, with the strategic patience that turns small advantages into victories. Chiron showed him how to read the weather in cloud formations, how to navigate by stars, how to find water in seemingly barren places. Every lesson carried layers beyond its surface. The sword forms taught balance and breath control. The star navigation taught humility before the vastness of existence. The hunting taught respect for life that must be taken to sustain life. But perhaps most importantly, Chiron taught him healing. They gathered herbs in meadows where wild thyme grew thick as carpets, learned which roots could draw poison from wounds, which leaves could reduce fever, which combinations could ease pain without stealing consciousness. Achilles' hands, so quick with weapons, proved equally deft with bandages and poultices. A true hero, Chiron told him one evening as they sorted dried lavender, knows that the power to harm and the power to heal spring from the same source. Strength without compassion makes monsters. Compassion without strength makes victims. You must be neither. In the evenings, when the day's lessons ended and the mountain air grew cool, Chiron taught him music. The ancient lyre responded to Achilles' touch as if it had been waiting for him. His fingers found melodies that seemed to have existed before sound itself, songs that made listeners remember things they had never experienced, feel homesick for places they had never been. He learned the old stories. The creation of the world from chaos, the wars of titans and gods. The heroes who had come before him, their triumphs and failures measured in bronze and blood. He learned that glory always had a price, and the price was always paid. Years passed in this way, measured not in seasons but in small transformations. Achilles grew taller, stronger, faster. His golden hair grew long enough to braid in the manner of warriors. His arms developed muscle shaped by spear practice and bow work. His voice deepened into the register of young manhood. But something else was growing too. A restlessness that had no name, a hunger that no amount of learning could satisfy. He would stand at the cave mouth in the evenings, looking down at the distant lights of human settlements, feeling something pull at him from below. The pull grew stronger as Achilles approached his 16th year. He could feel it in his bones like weather changing, a pressure against his ribs when he breathed the thin mountain air. Chiron noticed, though he said nothing for many months. The centaur had trained enough heroes to recognize the signs. The restlessness, the way the boy's eyes lingered on the horizon during sword practice, the way he played the lyre more fiercely now, as if trying to capture something that kept slipping away. One evening, as they sat beside the fire ring outside the cave, Chiron finally spoke of it. "Your mother will come for you soon," he said quietly. Achilles looked up from the spear he was sharpening. "How do you know?" "Because the world below is preparing for war. And wars of that magnitude do not begin without signs." Chiron poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Word has reached even this mountain. Helen of Sparta has been taken to Troy. Kings are gathering their forces. Ships are being built along every coast." The spear point gleamed in the firelight. Achilles tested its edge with his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. "What does that have to do with me?" "Everything." The centaur's voice carried the weight of prophecy. "You were born for exactly this moment. Every lesson, every story, every song has been preparing you for what comes next." "And what comes next?" Chiron was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant stars. "A choice," he said finally. "The most important choice any being, mortal or divine, can make." But before Achilles could ask what he meant, Thetis appeared at the edge of the firelight. She came as she always came, sudden and silent as tide. One moment the clearing was empty except for teacher and student. The next, the sea goddess stood among them, her robes the color of deep water, her hair moving as if touched by underwater currents. Her beauty was terrible and cold, like moonlight on winter ocean. "Mother," Achilles said, rising. He had not seen her in 3 years. "My son." Her voice held depths that made mortal ears ache. She looked at him as if memorizing every detail, his height now nearly matching Chiron's human torso. His shoulders broadened by years of training, his face still bearing traces of boyhood but hardening into the features of a man. "You have grown. Chiron has been an excellent teacher." "I know." Thetis turned to the centaur, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, gratitude, sorrow. "Thank you, old friend, for giving him these years." "They were not mine to give," Chiron replied. "They belonged to him and to the mountain. I merely provided guidance." Thetis moved closer to her son, and the temperature dropped several degrees. "We must leave tonight. There is a ship waiting at the coast." "I have made arrangements." "Arrangements for what?" Achilles asked, though part of him already knew. "To keep you safe." "To preserve your life." She reached for his hand, but he stepped back. "Safe from what?" "From Troy." "From the war that is gathering like a storm. From the fate that waits for you on those distant beaches." Her voice cracked slightly, the first sign of emotion he had ever heard from her. "I know what will happen if you go to war, Achilles." "I have seen it in prophecies, heard it whispered by the fates themselves. You will die there. Young, before your time, with all your potential unfulfilled." The fire crackled between them. An owl called from the dark forest beyond the clearing. "And if I do not go?" Achilles asked carefully. "Then you will live a long life. You will marry father-children, rule your father's kingdom in peace. You will grow old, surrounded by grandchildren, and when you finally die, it will be in your own bed, with your family weeping around you." She paused. "You will be forgotten within a generation. Your name will become a footnote in dusty genealogies. No songs will be sung of you. No stories told." Achilles looked at Chiron, who sat motionless as stone. The centaur's face revealed nothing. "But if you go to Troy," Thetis continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "your name will live forever. Songs will be sung of your deeds until language itself dissolves into silence. You will achieve glory beyond any mortal who has ever lived. But you will never see home again. You will never grow old. Your death will come swift and certain, and I will lose you." The choice hung in the air like the smoke from their fire, twisting and turning but never quite dispersing. Achilles understood now why the mountain had felt too small lately, why his blood had quickened at stories of distant battles. This was what he had been made for. This was why a goddess had loved a mortal king, why he had been dipped in the Styx, why Chiron had taught him not just to fight but to heal, not just to kill but to create beauty. "I need time to think," he said finally. Thetis's face tightened with something that might have been fear. "Time is the one thing we do not have. Odysseus is already searching for you. He knows that Troy cannot fall without your presence. If we are to hide you, it must be now, before he arrives. Where would we go?" "Skyros, an island far from the gathering armies. King Lycomedes is an old friend. He will shelter you among his daughters, disguised and safe." She took a step closer. "Please, Achilles." "Come with me now. Choose life over glory. Choose your mother over fate." In the firelight, her face looked almost human in its desperation. Achilles thought of the long life she offered. Peace, family, the gentle accumulation of quiet days. It was not unappealing. He had learned gentleness here on the mountain, learned the value of small beauties and simple pleasures. He could imagine that life could almost touch it, but he could also imagine the other path. The weight of armor, the rush of battle, the fierce joy of testing himself against the greatest warriors of the age. the songs that would carry his name across centuries, the glory that would burn so bright it would cast light into unimaginable futures. "I will come with you to Skyros," he said at last. "But I make no promises beyond that." It was not the answer Thetis wanted, but it was the only answer she would get. She nodded slowly, then turned to gather what few possessions Achilles owned. Chiron finally moved, rising to his full height. He placed one weathered hand on Achilles' shoulder. "Whatever you choose," the centaur said quietly, "choose it knowing yourself fully. A life lived in truth, however brief, is worth more than centuries of comfortable deception. Will I see you again?" Achilles asked, knowing the answer. "In this life?" Chiron smiled sadly. "Probably not. But I will watch for news of you, whether that news comes from quiet Skyros or bloody Troy. And I will remember the boy who learned to heal as well as harm, who played the lyre with the same passion he wielded a spear." They embraced, and Achilles felt the old centaur's strength one last time. Then Thetis was leading him down the mountain path, away from the cave that had been his home, away from the teacher who had shaped him, down toward the waiting ship and the uncertain future it represented. Behind them, Chiron stood watching until they disappeared into the darkness below. Then he returned to his fire, picked up the ancient lyre, and played a song of ending and beginning that echoed across the mountain until dawn. The ship waited where Thetis had said it would, tucked into a small cove where pine trees grew down to the water's edge. It was a modest vessel, not one of the grand warships being built in every harbor across Greece, but something quieter, designed to pass unnoticed. The crew was small, men whose faces were weathered by salt and discretion, who asked no questions and offered no conversation. Achilles stepped aboard as the first grey light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. The deck rocked gently beneath his feet, a sensation both strange and oddly familiar, as if his body remembered something his mind did not. Thetis stood at the prow, one hand resting on the carved figurehead, her robe shifting in the pre-dawn breeze. The crew pushed off without ceremony. Oars dipped into dark water, and the shore began to recede. Achilles watched Mount Pelion grow smaller, the cave where Chiron still sat becoming just another shadow among the rocks. He did not wave. Goodbyes were already finished. The voyage to Skyros took 3 days. Thetis spoke little during the journey, standing for hours at the ship's edge, gazing into waters that seemed to respond to her presence. Sometimes dolphins followed them, leaping in arcs of silver spray. Once, a pod of whales surfaced nearby, their great bodies rising and falling like breathing islands. Achilles spent the time watching the sea, learning its moods and rhythms. He had fought rivers on the mountain, had swum in cold streams, but this was different. The sea was vast and indifferent, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with human concerns. It did not care about prophecies or choices or the gathering storm of war. On the second evening, as stars emerged overhead, Thetis finally came to sit beside him. "You must understand what I am asking of you," she said quietly. "Skyros is not a prison, but it will feel like one. You cannot train openly. You cannot fight. You will need to move differently, speak differently, become someone you are not." "I understand disguise," Achilles replied. "Chiron taught me patience and observation. This is not observation. This is erasure." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "King Lycomedes has 7 daughters. You will live among them as one of them. You will wear their clothing, learn their crafts, adopt their manners. Your hair will grow long, your hands will soften. Everything that marks you as a warrior must be hidden." The idea should have repulsed him. Yet something in it intrigued him, the same way a particularly difficult puzzle might. To become invisible, to learn a world he had never entered. There was a kind of challenge in it. "And if Odysseus finds me anyway? Then the choice will be made for you." Thetis looked back at the water. "But Odysseus is clever, not omniscient. If you commit fully to the disguise, if you let yourself disappear into it, he will search and find nothing. He will move on to other strategies, other solutions. You believe Troy can fall without me." She was silent for a long moment. "I believe prophecies are slippery things. They tell what will happen, but not always when or how or at what cost. Troy may stand for decades yet. By the time it falls, if it falls, you could have lived a full life far from those walls." Achilles heard the hope in her voice, fragile as sea foam. She was bargaining with fate itself, trying to find loopholes in the pronouncements of the fates. He did not have the heart to tell her that he already knew how this would end. Skyros appeared on the third morning, rising from the sea like a grey-green dream. The island was smaller than Achilles had imagined, a place of rocky hills and scattered olive groves. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp in the salt air. The port town was modest, whitewashed buildings climbing up from the harbor toward the palace that crowned the central hill. They docked quietly. A small escort was waiting, not soldiers but attendants, women in simple robes who bowed deeply to Thetis and did not quite look at Achilles. King Lycomedes himself greeted them at the palace gates. He was an older man, his beard more gray than black, but his eyes were sharp and kind. He embraced Thetis as an old friend, then turned to study Achilles with an expression that mixed sympathy and resignation. "So this is the one we are to hide from the war," he said. "You have your mother's eyes, boy. Or should I say girl?" "Not yet," Thetis said, "but soon. I trust your household knows what is required. They know to ask no questions and remember no names." Lycomedes gestured toward the palace interior. "My daughters are expecting a new companion. They have been told she is a cousin from a distant island, shy and unaccustomed to court life. They will help with the transformation." Achilles felt something twist in his chest, not quite fear, but something close to it. On the battlefield, he would have known what to do. But this was a different kind of battle, one fought with fabric and gesture rather than bronze and blood. The daughters of Lycomedes appeared like a flock of bright birds, 7 young women ranging in age from perhaps 12 to 20. They surrounded Achilles with curiosity and gentle laughter, leading him away from his mother toward the women's quarters. Their voices overlapped like water over stones, asking questions, offering reassurances, already beginning the work of transformation. Thetis watched them go. When Achilles glanced back, he saw something in her face he had never seen before, not quite relief, but perhaps the distant cousin of it. The faintest shadow of hope that prophecy might be outmaneuvered after all. Then he turned the corner, and she was gone from sight. The transformation began immediately. The daughters of Lycomedes worked with the efficient kindness of those who had been well prepared. They led Achilles to a bathing chamber where steam rose from heated water scented with herbs he could not name. They helped him remove the simple tunic he had worn from the mountain, and he saw them notice the muscles beneath, the scars from training, the body built for war. But they said nothing. They simply began to wash away the dust of travel, the smell of mountain pine, the last traces of the life he had left behind. The water was hotter than he was accustomed to, almost uncomfortable against his skin. Achilles sat still as the women worked, their hands gentle but purposeful, washing his hair with oils that smelled of roses, and something sweeter, something that reminded him of the meadows below Chiron's cave in spring. The scent clung to him, foreign and intimate. One of the daughters, perhaps 16, with dark eyes and careful hands, began to comb through his hair. It was longer than a warrior should be, but not yet long enough for what they required. "It will grow," she said softly. "By summer's end, it will reach your shoulders. Until then, we can braid it in ways that suggest length." Another brought robes of fine linen, dyed in soft colors, pale green like new leaves, cream like foam on waves, nothing bold, nothing that would draw the eye. The fabric felt strange against his skin, lighter than he expected, clinging in unfamiliar ways. "You must learn to move differently," the eldest daughter said. Her name was Diadamia, and she carried herself with quiet authority. Men walk from the shoulders. Women move from the hips. Watch. She demonstrated, her steps measured and graceful. The other sisters followed suit, creating a kind of silent instruction. Achilles watched, absorbing the pattern, the subtle shift of weight, the way their arms hung differently at their sides. He tried. His first steps felt absurd, theatrical. But Diadamia smiled, not unkindly. "You think too much. It is not performance. It is simply how the body moves when it is not preparing for battle." They dressed him in layers, showing him how the robes fastened, how the belt sat higher on a woman's waist. They brought jewelry, simple pieces, a bronze bracelet, a necklace of small shells. Each addition felt like armor of a different kind, not for protection, but for concealment. When they finally led him to a polished bronze mirror, Achilles barely recognized the figure looking back. His face was still his own, still too sharp perhaps, too focused. But softened by the frame of oiled hair, dressed in flowing fabric, surrounded by the other daughters, he could almost believe the disguise might work. "We will call you Pyrrha," Diadamia said. "It means flame-colored, for your hair." The name settled over him like a cloak. Pyrrha. Not Achilles, not warrior, not son of prophecy. Just another daughter in a quiet palace on a distant island. The days developed their own rhythm, entirely different from anything he had known. On Mount Pelion, his mornings had begun with running, with weapons practice, with the careful study of tactics and history. Here, mornings began with weaving. The women's quarters contained several large looms, and the daughters of Lycomedes gathered there after breakfast, talking softly while their hands worked the threads. Achilles, now Pyrrha, sat among them with his own smaller loom, learning the basic patterns. His hands, trained to grip spear and sword, fumbled with the delicate threads at first. But those same hands also knew precision from the lyre, patience from healing work. Slowly, clumsily, he began to understand the rhythm of it. Warp and weft, the shuttle passing through. The gentle beat of the comb pressing the threads tight. Diadamia worked at the loom beside him, creating a pattern of birds in flight, their wings spread across deep blue background. She corrected his mistakes without comment, her fingers sometimes covering his to show the proper tension, the right angle. "You are learning quickly," she said one morning, perhaps a week into his stay. For someone supposedly raised far from court. Achilles kept his eyes on his work. "My mother taught me that any craft worth doing demands full attention. Wise mother." Diadamia's voice was warm. "Though I notice you watch the harbor more than the thread." It was true. From the women's quarters, one window looked down toward the port. Achilles found himself drawn to it, watching ships come and go, wondering which ones carried news of the gathering war, which might carry searchers. "I am unused to confinement," he admitted. "Then you should walk with us this afternoon. We gather herbs in the hills above the palace. The air is better there, and there are fewer eyes to watch." The hills of Skyros were nothing like Mount Pelion's forests, but they had their own spare beauty. Grey stone and tough grasses, ancient olive trees twisted by wind, wild thyme growing in purple patches among the rocks. The daughters walked together, baskets over their arms, laughing and talking while they searched for the plants they needed. Mint for stomach troubles, fennel for women's pains, chamomile for sleeplessness. Achilles walked slightly apart, learning the names of things that had never mattered in his previous life. Diadamia stayed near him, pointing out which leaves to gather, which to leave for later harvest. "You are unhappy here," she said quietly. "I am safe here," Achilles replied. That was the bargain. Safety and happiness are not always the same thing. He looked at her then, really looked. Diadamia was perhaps 18, with dark hair bound simply, eyes the color of the sea in winter. There was intelligence in her face, and something else, a kind of careful observation that reminded him of Odysseus, though gentler. "Do you ever feel trapped by safety?" he asked. She smiled slightly. "Every daughter of every king feels trapped by safety. We are precious things, kept behind walls, our futures decided by men who mean well but see us as pieces in larger games." "And do you resent it? Some days more than others." She bent to pluck a stem of oregano. "But resentment is a luxury. We learn instead to find freedom in small things, in choosing which robe to wear, in the patterns we weave, in walks like this, where for a few hours we are simply women among herbs and stones, not pawns waiting to be moved." Her words struck something in him. Was he so different now? Removed from the battlefield, hidden away, his fate decided by others who thought they knew best. Perhaps he and these daughters had more in common than he had imagined. That night, lying on the narrow bed in the room he shared with 3 of the younger sisters, Achilles stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the weight of a sword in his hand. The memory was already becoming dreamlike, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. He wondered how long a person could maintain a disguise before it stopped being disguise and became simply who they were. The moon rose outside the window, the same moon that shone on Troy's distant walls, on the gathering Greek armies, on his mother's waves. Achilles closed his eyes and let himself drift, suspended between 2 lives, belonging fully to neither. In the darkness, he heard one of the sisters murmur in her sleep, a soft sound like doves settling in their cote. He thought of Patroclus, far away in Phrygia, perhaps wondering where his friend had gone. He thought of Chiron on his mountain, of the cave where he had learned what it meant to be a hero. And he thought of the choice that still waited, patient as stone, for him to make it. The weeks turned like the shuttle through the loom, passing in rhythms Achilles had never known existed. Back and forth, the daily pattern woven without urgency or bloodshed. He learned to walk differently, weight shifting from the hips rather than the shoulders, steps smaller, hands held loosely at his sides instead of ready near where weapons should have hung. The youngest sister, barely 12, demonstrated the walk by gliding the length of the weaving room in complete silence, her feet never quite leaving the floor, and Achilles practiced until his warrior's stride softened into something that might pass unnoticed. His hair grew longer. The servants oiled it each morning with scent of roses, combing it smooth and binding it with simple bronze pins. His face, never heavily bearded even before, required only occasional attention with a sharp blade, done privately in the early morning when shadows still filled the chambers. The robes became familiar, the weight of fabric settling on his shoulders like a different kind of armor, pale green and cream-colored linen that whispered when he moved. In the polished bronze mirror, a stranger looked back, not quite woman, but no longer the warrior who had leapt from ships and driven enemies before him like autumn leaves. Something between, suspended, neither one thing nor the other. The looms became almost meditative. His hands, which had fumbled at first, found their rhythm. The shuttle passed through the shed with practiced ease now, the beater pressing each thread into place with soft, repetitive sound. He was making a length of cloth patterned with simple geometric shapes, nothing as ambitious as Diadamia's flying birds, but honest work nonetheless. Something Chiron might have approved of, if for different reasons. "You have good instinct for color," Diadamia observed one morning, watching him select new threads from the basket. "The blue you chose complements the ochre better than what I would have picked." Achilles glanced at her loom, where her birds now seemed to swim through sky made of layered sunset colors. "You are kind to say so." "I am honest to say so. There is difference." She tied off a thread and reached for another. "My father asks about you sometimes. Where you came from, why your family sent you here." His hand stilled on the shuttle for just a moment. "What do you tell him?" "That you are a cousin from the northern islands, where the women are tall and strong from climbing mountains? That your mother thought court life would soften your manners?" She smiled slightly. He seemed satisfied. Men rarely question stories about improving daughters. You protect me. I protect a secret that interests me. Didamir's winter sea eyes met his. Though I still do not fully understand what you are hiding from. Expectations, Achilles said quietly. The weight of what others need me to be. She nodded slowly, as if this answer made perfect sense. Yes, I understand that weight well enough. The afternoons brought escape to the hills. The herb gathering had become routine, the daughters venturing out with their baskets while the sun hung warm and golden above the island. Achilles walked among them, learning to identify plants by leaf shape and scent. Wild fennel grew tall along the stone walls. Oregano spread in fragrant patches. Tiny cyclamen bloomed in the shade of olive trees, their pink flowers like folded wings. Sometimes they sang while they worked, old songs about sailors and storms, about lovers separated by the sea. The sisters had clear voices that blended together like water over stones. Achilles listened, memorizing the melodies, occasionally adding his own voice low and careful, blending rather than standing out. On one such afternoon, clouds gathered to the west, dark and heavy with coming rain. The daughters began packing their baskets early, but Diademia lingered near an outcropping of rock where chamomile grew thick and sweet-smelling. There is storm coming, Achilles said, joining her. I know, but these will not wait for better weather. The flowers are perfect now. She plucked the small white blooms carefully, placing them in her basket without crushing the delicate petals. Everything has its moment. Miss it, and the opportunity passes. Achilles knelt beside her, helping gather the chamomile. His hands were gentle despite their size, despite what they had been trained for. Do you believe that? That each thing has only one right moment? Some things, perhaps. Didamia straightened, basket full. Though I think humans make too much of fate sometimes. We use it as excuse not to choose, not to act. We say the gods have decided, when really we have simply grown comfortable with waiting. The first drops of rain touched their faces. The other daughters were already hurrying back toward the palace, their voices calling through the wind. But Didamia stood still, letting the rain spot her robes, looking out toward the harbor where the water had turned gray and restless. You will leave eventually, she said. It was not a question. I do not know. Yes, you do. Whatever you are hiding from will find you, or you will grow tired of hiding. Either way, this stops being sanctuary and becomes simply cage. She turned to him. I am not fool enough to think otherwise. The rain fell harder. They should have been running for shelter, but neither moved. If I leave, Achilles said slowly, it will be towards something that ends quickly. That ends badly. You sound very certain of that. I am. Didamia's expression softened. And yet you still think about going, which means whatever waits out there matters more to you than length of days. She touched his arm briefly, the gesture quick and almost formal. I understand that too. The need for something beyond mere survival. They walked back through the rain together, robes growing heavy with water, hair plastered to their faces. By the time they reached the palace, they were soaked through and laughing, despite themselves at the absurdity of it, two people pretending to be what they were not, caught in a storm that cared nothing for disguises. The servants fussed over them, brought dry clothes and hot wine spiced with cinnamon. Achilles sat in the women's quarters while his wet robes were taken away, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, watching the storm lash the windows. Lightning flickered over the harbor. Thunder rolled across the hills like chariot wheels. Somewhere out there, ships were gathering. Armies assembling. The machinery of war grinding slowly forward whether he participated or not. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it brought a restlessness he could not name. That night, Didamia came to the sleeping chamber after the younger sisters had drifted off. She sat on the edge of Achilles' narrow bed, her presence a quiet interruption of routine. I brought you something, she whispered. From her robe she produced a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a bronze bracelet, simple but well made, decorated with a pattern of waves. Everything was provided, borrowed, part of the disguise. She pressed it into his hand. This is gift, not costume, something to keep or leave behind as you choose. The bronze was warm from her skin. Achilles turned it in his fingers, seeing his distorted reflection in its polished surface. I cannot accept this. You already have. Diademia stood, moving toward the door. Sleep well, Pyrrha. But she paused at the threshold and looked back. For what it is worth, I think whoever you truly are must be someone remarkable to inspire such elaborate protection. I hope they deserve it. Then she was gone, leaving only the scent of chamomile and rain behind. Achilles lay in darkness with the bracelet cool against his palm. Outside, the storm slowly exhausted itself. The thunder retreated across the water, the rain gentle to whisper. And in the silence that followed, he slipped the bronze band onto his wrist, where it rested light as prophecy, heavy as choice. The bracelet caught the lamplight each morning when Achilles dressed, a small gleam against skin that had grown softer during these months of silk and waiting. He wore it beneath the sleeve of his robes where it pressed cool against his pulse, a reminder of something he could not quite name. Not friendship exactly. Not love, though perhaps something adjacent to it, an acknowledgement between two people pretending they did not see through each other's carefully maintained fictions. The days continued their slow procession. Summer deepened across Skyros, turning the hillsides gold and filling the palace with the drowsy hum of bees drunk on thyme blossoms. The weaving room grew warm in the afternoons, and the daughters often moved their work to the shaded courtyard where a fountain splashed into a marble basin carved with dolphins. Achilles learned the rhythm of women's time, how it moved differently than the hours he had known on Mount Pelion, where days were measured in archery practice and foot races and the studying of stars. Here, time pooled and eddied. A single conversation might stretch across an entire afternoon. The choosing of thread colors could take an hour of gentle debate. Meals arrived when they arrived, and no one consulted the sun's position with military precision. It should have maddened him. Instead, he found himself settling into it like a stone sinking through clear water, descending into depths he had not known existed. Diademia showed him how to card wool properly, teasing the fibers apart until they lay parallel and soft. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, and Achilles found himself watching the way she worked rather than the work itself. She had a small scar on her left thumb, white against her olive skin. A childhood accident involving a spindle, she said when she caught him looking. You notice things, she observed. Most people look without seeing, but you actually watch. Is that wrong? No, just unusual. Most men I have met prefer not to look too closely at women's work. They think it beneath notice. Achilles pulled another tuft of wool from the basket. Then they are fools. There is craft in everything done well. My teacher on Pelion taught me that. He said a man who scorns any skill simply admits his own inadequacy. Your teacher sounds wise. He was a centaur, actually. Half horse, half man, all patience. The words slipped out before Achilles could catch them, a truth escaping through the gaps in his disguise. But Diademia only smiled. Of course he was, and I am sure you learned nothing useful from him about warfare or combat. Nothing at all, Achilles agreed, matching her tone. Only music and healing herbs and poetry. Naturally. The things every young maiden requires. They worked in companionable silence after that, the air between them lighter for the acknowledged pretense. The wool grew into soft piles of cloud-white fiber. Across the courtyard, Diademia's sisters laughed over some private joke, their voices bright as the water's splash. That evening, after the meal had been cleared and most of the household had retired, Achilles walked the palace corridors restlessly. The walls pressed close after a day of forced stillness. His body, trained for motion and conflict, rebelled against these long hours of sedentary craft. He found himself in a small practice courtyard he had discovered weeks earlier, a forgotten space behind the kitchens where herbs grew in terracotta pots and old amphoras stood stacked against the walls. Moonlight turned everything silver and shadow. Without conscious decision, his body began to move through the exercises Chiron had taught him. Not the full deadly sequences, those would have been too obviously martial, but the stretches and balances that maintained flexibility and strength. A warrior's meditation disguised as dance. He did not hear Didemir approach until she spoke. "So you do remember how to move like yourself?" Achilles froze mid-motion, balanced on one leg with the other extended behind him, arms spread like wings. Slowly, he lowered himself back to standing. "I could not sleep. Neither could I." She stepped fully into the courtyard, her sleeping robe pale in the moonlight. "I walk when my thoughts grow too loud. Usually I am alone. I am sorry for intruding." "You misunderstand. I did not say I minded the company." Didemir moved to sit on the edge of a stone planter where rosemary grew thick and fragrant. "What you were doing just then, that was beautiful. Like watching a heron or a hunting cat. Something built for a specific purpose, moving exactly as it should." Achilles remained standing, uncertain. The night air carried the scent of jasmine from somewhere deeper in the palace gardens. "My teacher believed the body was an instrument that required tuning, like a lyre left unplayed too long. And yours has been silent too long, perhaps." Didemir drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that made her look younger, more vulnerable than her usual composed demeanor. "May I ask you something truthful?" "You may ask. Not the same as promising to answer truthfully, I notice." She smiled slightly. "Very well. Here is my question. When you leave, and we both know you will, what do you think you will find out there? What is worth abandoning safety for?" Achilles sat down on the opposite side of the courtyard, his back against the sun-warmed stone wall. The question deserved more than a standing answer. I do not know if I can explain it to someone who has never felt it. This hunger for something beyond continued existence. My mother hid me here to give me a long life. A peaceful life. And those are not small gifts. But they are not the gifts you want. No. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. I was told once that I could choose. Long years of quiet happiness, or brief years of glory that would never be forgotten. Most people would call that an easy choice. "But glory is not nothing," Didemir said softly. "To be remembered. To have your name carried forward through ages you will never see, spoken by people you will never meet. There is a kind of immortality in that. A refusal to be erased by time. You understand? I understand wanting to matter, to have lived for something more than the passing of days." She looked up at the stars scattered across the sky like spilled silver. "Women are not offered such choices, of course. We get safety or we get stories, but rarely both, and almost never do we get to choose which. So perhaps I envy you even as I think you mad for choosing the shorter path." They sat in the darkness while the night deepened around them. Somewhere in the palace, a shutter banged in the wind. The smell of bread baking began to drift from the kitchens where servants prepared for the coming day. "If I go," Achilles said finally, "it will mean I never see the child." Didemir turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the shadows. "What child?" "Ours." The word hung in the air between them, impossible to retract. "Unless I am very much mistaken about what has passed between us these last months." For a long moment, Didemir said nothing. Then she began to laugh, soft and weary. "You notice everything," you said. "Of course you would notice that. Are you certain?" "As certain as one can be about such things." "Yes." She stood, brushing dust from her robe. "I thought I had hidden it well enough." but apparently not from eyes that actually see. Achilles rose also, closing the distance between them. "Why did you not tell me? Because I wanted you to choose your path without that weight added to the scale. Because I knew if you felt trapped by obligation, you would eventually resent both me and the child. Because," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "because I wanted to give you what your mother tried to give you, a chance at choice, however brief. That is remarkably generous, or remarkably foolish. I have not decided which." She reached up and touched his face, fingers light against his cheek. "Go to war if you must, swift-footed warrior hiding in women's robes. Find your glory and your brief flame. But know that something of you will remain here, growing toward a future you will not see. Perhaps that is its own kind of immortality." Then she turned and walked back toward the palace, leaving Achilles alone with the rosemary and the moonlight and the crushing weight of revelation. He stood there until dawn began to pale the eastern sky, until the first birds started their territorial songs, until the palace began to wake and the smell of baking bread grew stronger. And when he finally returned to the women's quarters to change into his robes for another day of weaving and pretense, the bronze bracelet caught the early light like a promise or a chain, impossible to distinguish which. The merchant ships arrived on a morning when the wind smelled of rain and distant places. Word spread through the palace like water finding cracks in stone, traders from the mainland bearing goods from lands beyond the horizon. The king's daughters gathered at the high windows to watch servants unload bundles wrapped in canvas, wooden chests bound with iron, amphoras sealed with wax. Achilles stood among them, throat tight with recognition he could not name. Something in the air had changed. The shape of fate approaching. "Father has invited the merchants to display their wares in the great hall," one of the younger daughters said, practically bouncing with excitement. "Silks from the east, they say, and perfumes. Real saffron, not the pale imitation we usually get." Didymir caught Achilles' eye across the room. Her hand rested on her stomach, a gesture so brief anyone else would have missed it. Then she turned away, face carefully neutral. The afternoon found them assembled in the hall where light fell through high windows in dusty columns. The merchant stood at the center, a compact man with gray threading his beard and the weathered face of someone who had spent years reading horizons. His assistant began unwrapping bundles with practiced efficiency. Fabric spilled across tables like captured sunset, crimson silk that whispered when touched. Wool dyed the deep blue of twilight. Linen fine enough to see your hand through, suitable for summer robes. The daughters moved forward with small sounds of pleasure, fingers reaching for texture and color. Achilles remained at the back, every muscle coiled with alertness he could not justify. The merchant produced vials of perfume next, letting each princess sample the scents. Oil of roses. Myrrh mixed with honey. Something called frankincense that smelled of temples and distant gods. Then came jewelry, copper bangles, carved ivory combs, a necklace of blue Egyptian faience beads. "And here," the merchant said, his voice carrying a different quality now, "something for those who appreciate more practical crafts." His assistant unveiled a shield. Bronze-faced, perfectly balanced, its surface polished to mirror brightness. Beside it, wrapped in oiled cloth, a sword. Not ceremonial, not decorative. A weapon built for hands that understood violence. The room went very quiet. Achilles felt his pulse in his throat, his palms, the scarred knuckles he kept hidden beneath long sleeves. Every instinct screamed for him to reach for the blade, to feel its weight, to test its balance. He forced himself to remain still, eyes downcast, breathing carefully measured. An unusual thing to bring to ladies, King Lycomedes observed, though his tone held more curiosity than offense. "Forgive me, Lord King. These were commissioned for a nobleman in Mycenae, but he died before delivery. Rather than carry them back to the mainland, I thought perhaps they might interest your guards, or serve as decoration, if nothing else. The workmanship is exceptional." One of the daughters giggled nervously. Another moved closer to examine her reflection in the shield's polished surface. They treated the weapons like curiosities, foreign objects from a world they barely acknowledged. Achilles felt sweat bead along his spine. The sword lay 3 paces away, close enough to reach in 2 heartbeats. His fingers twitched. Didymir was watching him. Not obviously, not with direct gaze, but he felt the weight of her attention like pressure against his ribs. The merchant was watching too, Achilles realized. Not the daughters admiring silk, not the king nodding politely. The merchant's eyes kept returning to the tall figure in the flowing robes at the back of the hall, the one standing too still, breathing too carefully. "Perhaps," the merchant said casually, "the young ladies would enjoy seeing how such weapons are properly handled. My assistant was a soldier once." He could demonstrate. The war horn split the afternoon like an axe through wood. Deep, bronze-throated, the sound of ships spotted offshore or raiders approaching the harbor. The sound that meant danger, that meant defense, that bypassed thought and spoke directly to the part of the mind that understood survival. The daughters scattered like startled birds, hands flying to throats, small shrieks of alarm. They fled toward the inner chambers, toward safety, toward anywhere that was not here with that terrible sound still echoing off stone walls. All except one. Achilles had the sword in his hand before conscious thought engaged. The weight of it sang through bone and muscle like coming home. His other hand reached for the shield, lifting it with the automatic precision of 1,000 practice hours. His stance shifted, balanced, ready, the awkward feminine posture dropping away like a shedskin. The hall went silent, except for the fading echo of the horn. Achilles looked up to find every eye upon him. The king, frozen in his seat. The servants, hands arrested mid-motion. The merchant, wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. And beside the merchant, lowering the horn he had just blown, stood Odysseus. Not disguised, not pretending. Just Odysseus of Ithaca, clever-eyed and patient, watching Achilles with the look of a fisherman who has finally landed a catch he has pursued for months. "Well," Odysseus said mildly. "That was easier than I expected." Achilles felt the moment crystallize around him, sharp-edged and inescapable. The sword in his grip, the shield on his arm. His true nature revealed as completely as if he had stripped naked before the entire court. There was no walking this back, no gentle explanation that would return him to the fiction of maidenhood. The choice his mother had tried to prevent was here, now, unavoidable. He could drop the weapons. Claim confusion, fear, instinct. Try to salvage the disguise, though everyone in this room now knew the truth. Stay on Skyros and watch ships sail toward Troy without him, grow old beside Didymir, meet his son when the child could walk and talk, and ask questions about his father's careful hands. Or he could accept what his body had already chosen. Accept what some part of him had known since the moment the merchant ships appeared on the horizon. Achilles looked at Deidameia. She stood near the window, one hand pressed to her stomach, her face carefully blank, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. She did not speak, did not plead or protest. She simply looked at him with the expression of someone watching a ship depart for waters it will not return from. The bronze bracelet pressed cool against his pulse beneath his sleeve, hidden still, a secret between heartbeats. "My name," Achilles said clearly, letting his voice drop to its natural register, "is Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. I have been hidden here by my mother's design, dressed in robes, and taught weaving to keep me from the war at Troy." "We know," Odysseus said gently. "The question is whether you will come willingly, or whether I must persuade you." Achilles looked again at the sword in his hand, feeling the perfect balance, the way it fit his grip as if forged specifically for these fingers. Everything his mother had tried to prevent. Everything prophecy had promised and warned against. Brief life. eternal glory. The choice presented again, inescapable. "I will come," he said, and heard in those 3 words the shape of his entire future, compressed and certain. "Give me until dawn to prepare." The afternoon light had shifted to amber by the time the hall finally emptied. King Lycomedes had withdrawn to his chambers, his face carved from disappointment and political calculation. The servants dispersed with anxious whispers. Odysseus waited by the merchant's abandoned wares, patient as winter. Achilles stood alone in the center of the hall, still holding the sword. The weight of it felt right, in a way nothing had felt right for months. He turned it slowly, watching light travel along the blade's length. "You made it too easy," he said to Odysseus without looking up. "You were ready to be found." Odysseus's voice carried neither judgment nor triumph. Men who truly wish to hide do not stand so tall, do not move with such restraint, as if constantly remembering to be smaller than they are. Achilles set the sword down carefully on the table. The metal rang once against wood, a sound like a bell marking hours. "My mother will be furious." "Your mother," Odysseus said quietly, "loves you enough to try preventing fate. But we both know how that particular endeavor tends to conclude." The door to the inner chambers opened. Deidamia entered carrying nothing, her hands empty at her sides. She had changed from the dress she wore earlier, now wearing simpler robes of undyed linen. Her hair was bound back from her face, revealing the strong lines of jaw and cheekbone. She looked, Achilles thought, like someone preparing for a funeral. "The household is preparing a feast," she said. Her voice was steady, carefully controlled. "To honor your departure, my father insists." "You do not need to. I want to." She moved closer, each step deliberate. "Tomorrow you will leave. Tonight I would like to sit beside you one final time without pretense." Odysseus made a small sound that might have been a cough or discretion taking physical form. "I should inspect the ships," he said, to no one in particular. "Ensure the crews are ready for dawn departure." He left without ceremony, footsteps fading down the corridor. Deidamia and Achilles stood in the empty hall. Light fell through high windows, painting everything the color of old honey. Dust moved slowly through the beams, tiny galaxies drifting. "You knew," Achilles said. "Not a question. Not at first." She reached up, touched his face with careful fingers. "But yes, eventually. The way you watched the sea. How your hands remembered themselves in sleep, making grips around invisible weapons. Small things, 100 small things that added together into truth. You said nothing. What would I have said?" Her hand fell away. "Stay hidden?" "Deny what you are? I have seen you these months, Achilles. Seen the way you fade a little each day, like a fire slowly suffocating beneath green wood. Whatever else Troy means, at least there you will burn bright." He caught her hand, held it between both of his. The bracelet shifted against his wrist, bronze warming from body heat. "Our son will know his father was the greatest warrior who ever lived." Her smile was sad, fierce, already grieving. "I will tell him stories. How you ran faster than wind. How, even disguised, you could not fully hide what you were. How you chose glory, though it cost you everything." "That is not comfort." "No," she agreed. "But it is truth, and truth is what I can give him." They stood together as the light deepened toward evening. Outside, the compound stirred with preparation. Servants moved between buildings carrying wine amphorae and platters. Somewhere, musicians tuned instruments for the feast, the ordinary sounds of life continuing despite knowledge of coming loss. "Will you tell me about it?" Deidamia asked quietly. "About what happens when you leave." Achilles thought of the prophecy his mother had whispered long ago. The choice between long life and eternal memory. The beach at Troy where his feet would first touch sand. Patroclus, waiting among the gathered armies, friend he had not yet met who would matter more than breathing. Ships, he said instead. 1,000 ships crossing wine-dark water. Troy rising above the coastal plain with walls that have never fallen. Men I will fight beside. Battles that will be remembered when mountains have worn to dust. And your death? He had expected the question, but still felt its impact like a blade finding ribs. Quick, they say, an arrow. A god's guidance. The one place my mother's protection could not reach. His free hand moved unconsciously to his heel. Not for many years yet. But yes, it waits there. The price of being remembered. Was the choice difficult? She asked it simply, wanting to understand rather than to judge. Achilles thought about the moment he had held the sword, the way his body knew what to do before mind could interfere. The feeling of rightness that had surged through him like wine or starlight. No, he admitted. That is perhaps the saddest part. The choice was already made before I knew I was making it. I have been walking toward Troy since before I could walk at all. Didamia nodded slowly. Her hand in his was warm, alive, utterly mortal in its temporary perfection. Then I am grateful, she said, for the months you spent walking differently. For the time you let yourself be hidden, even knowing how it would end. I did not do it well. You did it for love. She squeezed his fingers. That counts for something. The feast, when it came, was elaborate and strangely subdued. King Lycomedes presided with forced joviality, making toasts to Achilles' courage and Greece's coming victory. The daughters who had been Achilles' companions ate quietly, stealing glances at the warrior in their midst, who had worn their clothes and shared their chambers. Odysseus ate sparingly, watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. Achilles barely tasted the food. He was aware of Deidameia beside him, the warmth of her presence, the way she laughed at appropriate moments, though her eyes remained sad. The bracelet circled his wrist beneath his sleeve. A secret, a promise. A reminder that some things endure beyond the reach of prophecy. When the feast finally ended and guests dispersed to sleeping chambers, Achilles walked to the edge of the compound. The sea spread dark beyond the walls, stars reflected on its surface like scattered silver. Tomorrow the ships would sail. Tomorrow he would begin the journey his mother had tried to prevent. Tomorrow he would step into the story that poets would tell for generations uncounted. Tonight he stood on Skyros beneath familiar stars, feeling the last hours of this particular life slip away like water through cupped hands. It was not regret he felt exactly. More like acknowledgement, the recognition that every choice, even the inevitable ones, carries weight. The door opened behind him. Deidameia approached, wrapped in a cloak against the night breeze. They did not speak, did not need to. They simply stood together, watching darkness and stars, letting silence hold what words could not adequately contain. When dawn came, pale and inevitable, Achilles would board Odysseus's ship. He would sail toward Troy and the destiny waiting there like a patient lover. But that was dawn. For now, there was night. There was the sound of waves against stone. There was the warmth of another human standing close enough to share breath. It was not the life his mother had wanted for him. But standing here, feeling the wind that would carry him toward glory and early grave, Achilles found he could not wish himself elsewhere. The choice was made. The path was clear. By morning, the warrior would be gone. The ships rode at anchor in the harbor below, dark shapes against darker water, waiting for dawn's first light to carry them toward destiny. Achilles remained at the compound's edge, watching the eastern horizon where night still held firm against the coming day. Beside him, Deidamia's breathing came soft and steady, a sound that anchored him to this moment, this place, even as everything pulled toward departure. Behind them, the compound had fallen quiet. The feast's lamps guttered and died. Servants retired to their quarters. The king's daughters withdrew to chambers where Achilles had once slept among them, hidden and safe and utterly false. "The baby will need a name," Didymir said. Her voice barely carried above the waves. "When he comes." Achilles had not thought of names, had not let himself think too far into a future he would not witness. But now the question settled over him like a cloak. "You choose," he said. "You will know him. You will watch him grow. The name should come from the one who stays." "Neoptolemus," she replied without hesitation. "New warrior. It seems fitting." The name carved itself into memory, Neoptolemus. A son he would never teach to hold a spear. A son who would grow tall in his absence, learning of his father through stories and silence. "He will have questions," Achilles said. "Yes." "What will you tell him?" Didymir considered the darkness, the stars, the waiting ships. That his father chose glory over safety. That love is not always measured in years. That some flames burn bright because they burn briefly. She paused. And that despite everything, you were gentle when gentleness mattered. Achilles felt something tighten in his chest. Not regret, precisely. More like the recognition of doors closing, paths untaken solidifying into permanent absence. Will that be enough? For him, perhaps not. For the world, yes. Didymir turned to face him. "Your story is larger than any life you might have lived here. That is what prophecy means. Not that you had no choice, but that your choice would echo." The eastern sky began to pale, darkness thinning at its edges like worn fabric. Not dawn yet, but dawn's first whisper, the promise of light coming. Achilles removed the bronze bracelet from beneath his sleeve. It caught the starlight, warm from contact with his skin. He held it out to Didymir. "Keep this," he said. "So the boy knows I carried something of him, something of you." She took the bracelet, fingers closing around metal that held his warmth. "I will tell him," she promised. Everything worth remembering. They stood close enough to touch, close enough to feel each other's heat against the night's chill. The moment stretched, neither wanting to be the first to step away, both knowing that first step was inevitable. Below, on the beach, torches flickered to life. Sailors moved among the ships, preparing for departure. Voices carried up the cliff face, commands and responses, the practical language of sea journeys beginning. "Will you come down to watch?" Achilles asked. "No." Didymir's voice remained steady. "I will remember you here, in darkness, before the sun could take you." That is a better ending than waving from shore. Achilles understood. Some farewells required privacy. Some losses could not be performed for witnesses. He touched her face once, fingers tracing the curve of her cheek, committing the shape of her to memory that would have to serve for all the years remaining. "Thank you," he said, "for teaching me gentleness, for showing me what I was leaving behind." "Thank you for being worth finding," she replied. "Even in disguise." Then she turned and walked back toward the compound, cloak trailing behind her like water. She did not look back, did not pause. Her footsteps faded into silence, and Achilles stood alone at the edge, watching the horizon lighten. Dawn came slowly, then suddenly. One moment the world hung in twilight, the next the sun broke free of the sea's grip, spilling gold across water and stone. Time to go. Achilles descended the cliff path. His feet knew the way, though he had walked it few times. Below, Odysseus stood among his men, directing the loading of provisions. He saw Achilles approach and nodded once, a gesture that conveyed understanding and expectation in equal measure. "Ready?" Odysseus asked. "Yes." The ship Achilles would board smelled of pitch and salt and old wood. Its prow was carved in the shape of a dolphin, mouth open as if laughing or crying. He stepped aboard, feeling the deck shift beneath his weight, the vessel responding to the presence of cargo it would carry toward war. Other ships were already pushing off, oars dipping into harbor water. The fleet began to move, timbers groaning, sails unfurling to catch morning wind. Skyros fell away behind them, cliffs growing smaller, compound disappearing into the island's green heights. Achilles stood at the rail, watching the island shrink. Somewhere up there, Didymir stood at the edge, or perhaps had returned to her chambers. Somewhere up there, his son grew in darkness, waiting to be born into a world where his father was already legend. The sea stretched ahead, wine dark and endless. Troy waited beyond the horizon, walls that had never fallen, a war that would consume 10 years and countless lives. Patroclus waited there, friend he had not yet met, whose death would matter more than his own. Hector waited, noble and doomed. Glory waited, sharp-edged and unforgiving. Achilles thought of his mother's grief, heavy as ocean depths. Thought of the prophecy that had shaped his entire existence. Long life in obscurity, or brief flame burning bright enough to illuminate centuries. He had made his choice on a feast day, hand closing around a sword that sang with recognition. Now he sailed toward the consequences, armor not yet forged, doom not yet measured, name not yet carved into the permanent record of human memory. The wind filled the sails. The ship picked up speed, cutting through waves that had witnessed the passage of countless heroes, countless fools, countless men who believed their choices mattered against the vast indifference of fate. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps every choice mattered precisely because fate waited at the end of every path, patient and inevitable. Achilles closed his eyes, feeling sun on his face, wind in his hair. Behind him, Skyros dissolved into memory. Ahead, Troy rose like a promise or a threat. He was ready. The warrior was coming home. The fleet moved as one body across water that caught morning light like hammered bronze. 40 ships, sails billowing white against blue, their painted prows cutting foam trails that stretched behind them like the threads of some vast loom-weaving pattern across the sea. Achilles remained at the rail, watching distance swallow the last trace of Skyros. The island became a shadow, then a suggestion, then nothing but empty horizon, where sea met sky in a line so perfect it might have been drawn by divine hands. Around him, sailors moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting ropes, checking provisions, speaking little. These were Odysseus's men, hardened by years of seafaring, their hands scarred by salt and labor. They gave the young warrior respectful distance, sensing something in his stillness that discouraged casual conversation. The dolphin figurehead at the prow rode the waves, wooden mouth frozen in its eternal expression of joy or sorrow. Achilles found himself studying it, wondering who had carved such ambiguity into simple wood. The craftsmanship was fine, each tooth distinct, each curve of the body suggesting movement even in stillness. Beautiful work, isn't it? Odysseus appeared beside him, moving silently despite the creaking deck. My shipwright carved it. Said dolphins were sacred to sailors because they guided lost ships home. Do you believe that? Achilles asked. I believe the sea keeps its own counsel, Odysseus replied. And sailors tell stories to make darkness less lonely. He leaned against the rail, eyes scanning the horizon with the automatic vigilance of a man who trusted nothing he couldn't verify personally. You're thinking about what you left behind. It wasn't a question. Achilles didn't answer immediately, letting silence speak for him. The ship rose and fell with the rhythm of waves, that ancient pulse that predated humanity, that would continue long after the last human voice fell silent. Didymir gave me a gift, Achilles said finally. She showed me what peace looked like, what it felt like to wake without armor, to eat without watching doorways, to speak without measuring every word for strategic value. And now you sail toward a place where those luxuries won't exist for 10 years. Odysseus's voice carried neither judgment nor sympathy, just observation. Some might call that a poor exchange. Some might. Achilles turned from the rail, meeting the older man's eyes. But the exchange was made long before I understood what I was trading. Odysseus nodded slowly. Prophecy is a cage made of words. We spend our lives either fighting the bars or learning to live within them. He straightened, preparing to return to his duties. The wind is good. We'll make Aulis by tomorrow evening if it holds. Aulis, Achilles repeated. The name carried weight. There, he would meet the other heroes gathering for the great assault. There, the scattered pieces of his destiny would begin assembling into recognizable shape. Get some rest, Odysseus advised. The sea is calm now, but weather changes. Sleep while you can. It's a skill every soldier learns or dies lacking. He moved away, calling orders to his crew. Achilles remained at the rail a moment longer, then made his way to the small shelter near the stern where passengers could escape sun and spray. The space smelled of tar and old rope, and the particular mustiness of enclosed spaces aboard ships. A woven mat covered the planking, surprisingly clean. Someone had placed a waterskin and a small bundle of dried fruit within arm's reach. Achilles sat, feeling the constant motion of the vessel beneath him. Back on Skyros, servants had prepared elaborate sleeping chambers with soft cushions and silk sheets. Here, comfort meant a dry place out of the wind, water that didn't taste too strongly of its container, and enough space to stretch out without touching damp wood. He found he preferred it. Luxury made men soft, made them forget the essential simplicity of existence: food, water, shelter, purpose. Everything else was decoration, beautiful perhaps, but ultimately dispensable. The rocking of the ship carried a hypnotic quality. Achilles closed his eyes, not quite sleeping but drifting in that space between waking and dreams where thoughts moved with oceanic slowness. He thought of Deiodamia standing in darkness, hand pressed against her belly where life grew. He thought of his mother in her underwater palace, surrounded by sisters who sang songs of sorrow, for sons who chose glory over breath. He thought of Patroclus, that name spoken by Chiron years ago with particular emphasis. "You'll meet him at Troy," the centaur had said. When you do, remember, the gods give us companions not to ease our burdens, but to make our burdens worth bearing. The sun climbed higher, warming the deck, baking salt into the wood grain. Sailors changed shifts, their movements careful and choreographed. One began singing, voice rough but true, a song about fishermen and storms and wives who waited at harbor's edge. Others joined in, harmonizing without conscious thought, voices weaving together as their hands wove rope. Achilles listened, letting the melody wash over him. Mortals sang to mark time, to transform labor into ritual, to remind themselves they weren't alone in the vastness. He wondered if gods ever sang, or if immortality made music unnecessary. Toward afternoon, clouds gathered at the northern horizon, towering structures of white and gray that promised rain but remained distant. The wind shifted slightly, and sailors adjusted sails with practiced ease, reading weather in ways that seemed half knowledge, half divination. Storms breaking east, one called down from the mast where he clung like some improbable bird. "We'll miss the worst of it." "Keep watching," Odysseus shouted back. "Sea changes faster than women's minds." Laughter rippled through the crew, the easy camaraderie of men who'd sailed together long enough to anticipate each other's movements. Achilles envied them briefly. He had trained with Chiron in isolation, learned skills meant for individual combat rather than collective effort. Warriors fought alone, even when surrounded by armies. These men understood something different, a unity born from mutual dependence on hostile elements. By evening, the clouds had passed behind them, and the sea turned glassy, reflecting sunset colors so vivid they seemed painted on rather than real. The fleet spread out across the water, each ship maintaining visual contact with its neighbors, but allowing generous distance between them. Food was distributed, simple fare of hard bread, olives, dried fish. Achilles ate mechanically, fuel rather than pleasure, though he noted the sailors took visible enjoyment from their meal, talking and joking as if dining in some fine hall rather than perched on shifting planks above fathomless water. Night fell gently, stars emerging one by one until the sky glittered with countless points of silver light. The air cooled, and men wrapped themselves in cloaks, huddling near the small brazier that provided more psychological comfort than actual warmth. Achilles returned to his shelter, lying down on the woven mat. Through gaps in the structure's sides, he could see stars tracking their eternal paths. His mother had taught him their names, the stories written in their patterns. Heroes who died and been lifted to the heavens as consolation, though he'd always wondered if spending eternity as decoration seemed reward or punishment. Sleep came gradually, breaking over him like gentle waves. In dreams, he stood on beaches that stretched endlessly in both directions, sand fine as powdered bone. Ahead, a city rose against impossible sky, walls higher than mountains, gates that had never opened to invaders. Troy, even in dreams, its name carried power. He woke before dawn to find the fleet still moving steadily south, sails ghostly in pre-dawn dimness. Sailors moved about their tasks quietly, respecting the hush that preceded sunrise. Someone was making tea from dried herbs, the smell sharp and oddly comforting. "Land before evening," a sailor told him, passing him a cup of the bitter brew. Aulis. "You'll see the other ships soon, whole forests of masts filling the harbor." Achilles nodded thanks, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. The tea tasted of earth and smoke, grounding him in physical sensation after dreams' vague territories. The sun rose behind them, painting their shadows long across the deck. Ahead, the sea continued its endless rolling, patient and indifferent. Somewhere beyond sight, Aulis waited with its gathering of heroes, its politics and prophecies, its 1,000 ships preparing to carry war across water to Troy's stubborn gates. Achilles stood at the prow, feeling wind push against his face, tasting salt on his lips. The boy who had hidden in silk was gone. The warrior was emerging, blade slowly being drawn from its sheath. By afternoon, they saw the first ships. Then more. Then the harbor opened before them, crowded with vessels, until the water seemed more wood than liquid. Aulis, where destinies converged and the future balanced on wind and ambition, the prophecy was unfolding. The choice was made, and Achilles, sailing toward glory that would outlive empires, felt something like peace settle over him. "Ready," he had said, and he was. The ships of Aulis crowded the harbor like petitioners at a temple gate, hulls pressed together until the water between them vanished into shadow. Standards flew from mast tops, each bearing the symbols of different kingdoms, different kings, different dreams of glory that would merge into one singular purpose. The air smelled of tar and salt and cooking fires, underlaid with the sharper tang of too many men living too close together for too long. Odysseus guided his vessel through the crowded approaches with practiced precision, calling orders that his crew executed without hesitation. They found mooring space near the southern edge of the anchorage, between a Cretan ship with eyes painted on its prow and a scarred vessel from Rhodes that looked like it had survived more storms than any captain had right to expect. "Welcome to patience," Odysseus said, helping secure the lines himself despite having men to do it. "We've been here 3 weeks waiting for winds that won't blow." Achilles stepped onto the dock, feeling solid ground after 2 days of subtle motion. The harbor stretched in all directions, a forest of masts and rigging creating patterns against the sky. Somewhere among these ships were names he knew from stories, warriors whose deeds had reached even Skyros's hidden shores. "How many?" he asked. "Near 1,000 ships when all arrive." Odysseus paused to examine a rope's condition, found it acceptable. Agamemnon commands from the largest vessel naturally. Myrmidons are camped on the northern beach. Your father's contingent, waiting for you. The Myrmidons. His people, though he'd barely spent time among them, warriors sworn to Pelias, who would now follow his son to whatever end fate provided. The responsibility settled on his shoulders like physical weight. The camp sprawled inland from the harbor, organized chaos of tents and fire pits, and areas cleared for training. Men sat in groups sharpening weapons, mending armor, throwing dice carved from knuckle bones. Some looked up as Odysseus and Achilles passed, recognition flickering across faces as they noted the young warrior's bearing, the way he moved like contained lightning. "That's him," voices murmured. Achilles, hidden on Skyros all this time. Thetis' son. They say he can't be killed. Everyone can be killed. Just takes the right blade in the right spot. Achilles heard the whispers but didn't acknowledge them. He'd learned in childhood that attention could be burden or blessing depending on circumstances. Here, surrounded by men preparing for war, being noticed meant being measured, evaluated, compared to stories that had grown in his absence. The Myrmidon camp occupied high ground overlooking the harbor, tents arranged in precise military order that spoke of discipline and experience. Standards bearing his father's symbol, a golden eagle, stood at the camp's center. Men paused in their tasks as Odysseus led Achilles through the ordered rows. An older warrior approached, armor polished until it reflected the afternoon sun. His face bore scars that told stories of previous battles, and his eyes carried the calm assessment of someone who'd survived by understanding threats before they materialized. "Phoenix," Odysseus greeted him warmly. "I brought your lost prince." Phoenix stopped before Achilles, studying him with an intensity that felt neither judgmental nor merely curious. "You have your mother's eyes," he said finally, "and your father's jaw. I taught you to walk when you were still unsteady on new legs. You won't remember." "I remember stories," Achilles replied. "My father spoke of you. Said you were worth 10 ordinary warriors and twice as stubborn." Phoenix's weathered face creased with something approaching a smile. "Stubbornness keeps men alive when cleverness fails." He gestured toward the largest tent. "Your quarters are prepared. The men are eager to meet you properly, but that can wait until you found your footing in this strange place." The tent was simple but adequate, furnished with a sleeping pallet, wooden chest for belongings, small table-bearing water basin, and oil lamp. Through the fabric walls, Achilles could hear the camp's constant background noise, voices, footsteps, metal striking metal, someone singing off-key. "Rest," Phoenix suggested. "Council meets at sunset in Agamemnon's tent. Your presence is expected, but not required tonight. Tomorrow is soon enough for politics." After Phoenix departed, Achilles stood in the tent's center, adjusting to yet another displacement. From mountain to hidden island to ship to war camp, each transition stripping away previous contexts until only the essential self remained. He wondered who that self would prove to be. Outside, someone was teaching others to throw spears at targets, calling corrections about stance and release point. The rhythmic thunk of bronze points striking wood created meditation of sorts, marking time in regular intervals. Achilles unpacked his few possessions. The lyre carefully wrapped, weapons well maintained. Chiron's final gift, a small stone carved with symbols meaning courage and wisdom, which his teacher had pressed into his palm during their last conversation. "Remember," Chiron had said, "that the greatest warriors know when not to fight." The advice seemed distant now, theoretical rather than practical. This harbor full of warriors existed for single purpose. Fighting was assumption, foundation, promise. The only question was when and how, not whether. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Achilles walked to the beach where waves rolled in with patient repetition. A few men trained in the shallows, practicing formations in ankle-deep water. Others sat on rocks, talking in voices too low to hear, faces turned toward the north where Troy waited beyond sight. He found a clear space and drew his sword, feeling its balance, testing movements that needed no thought. The blade cut air in patterns Chiron had taught, forms refined through countless repetitions until they lived in muscle memory deeper than consciousness. A small crowd gathered to watch, maintaining respectful distance. They didn't speak, just observed, evaluating this young warrior whose reputation preceded him like herald announcing king's arrival. Achilles ignored them, focusing on movement itself. Advance, retreat, parry, strike. The sword became extension of intention, translating thought into action without pause for decision. This was language he understood completely, vocabulary of edge and point and weight in motion. When he finished, breathing barely elevated despite the exertion, he turned to find an old man watching from nearby. White-bearded, bent with age, but eyes sharp as obsidian, he leaned on a staff carved with intricate patterns. "Calchas," someone whispered. "The seer." The old man nodded greeting. "You move well," he observed. "Chiron taught you properly." But technique alone won't determine what comes. Prophecy? Achilles asked, sheathing his sword. Observation, Calchas corrected. I don't need visions to know that skill and fate often pull in different directions. This war... He paused, gazing toward the northern horizon. This war will consume the willing and unwilling alike. Glory and grief arrive together, two faces of the same god. I've chosen glory. Have you? Calchas tilted his head bird-like. Or has it chosen you? The distinction matters, though perhaps not in ways that comfort offers. Before Achilles could respond, Phoenix approached with another man, younger, with keen eyes that suggested intelligence combined with curiosity rather than cunning. Achilles, this is Patroclus, Phoenix introduced them. Son of Menoetius. He arrived last week from Opus. I thought you two should meet. Patroclus inclined his head respectfully. I've heard much about you, he said simply. Welcome to this strange gathering of hopes and weapons. Something in his directness appealed to Achilles. No flattery, no false familiarity, just acknowledgement of shared circumstances. Thank you, he replied. Phoenix seems to think we'll find common ground. Phoenix thinks many things, Patroclus said with gentle humor. Some even prove true. They walked back toward camp together as sunset painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose. Around them, men settled into evening routines. Cook fires bloomed like flowers opening to darkness. The smell of roasting meat drifted through the air, making Achilles realize he'd eaten little since morning. The waiting is hardest, Patroclus observed. Warriors train for action, not patience. But winds won't blow, and seers offer cryptic advice about goddesses and sacrifices. Sacrifices? Patroclus's expression darkened slightly. Artemis demands price for the wind. Agamemnon's daughter. They're negotiating still, though what exactly one negotiates when gods make demands, I couldn't say. The weight of this settled over their conversation like evening fog. Human cost measured against divine requirement, individual tragedy weighed against collective ambition. War beginning with death before a single ship sailed toward enemy shores. They reached the Myrmidon camp as full darkness fell. Stars emerged overhead, distant and indifferent. Someone was playing a flute, melody wandering through minor keys that suggested longing for homes already growing distant in memory. Phoenix appeared bearing bowls of stew, bread still warm from the fire. They ate together in companionable quiet, and Achilles found himself grateful for company that didn't demand performance or explanation. Rest well, Phoenix finally said, rising. Tomorrow brings councils and politics. Tonight, just be young men far from home, sharing food under stars that have watched other wars, other heroes, other stories that seemed important until they passed into silence. The morning arrived cool and grey, with mist hanging low over the harbor like something dreaming itself into existence. Achilles woke to sounds already familiar, voices calling across water, metal striking stone, the perpetual background hum of an army waiting. He dressed simply, strapping sandals, buckling belt, running fingers through hair that never quite submitted to order. Through the tent opening, he could see men moving with morning purpose, carrying water, tending fires, preparing for another day suspended between departure and stillness. Patroclus was already awake, sitting on a flat stone near the tent entrance, cleaning armor with methodical attention. He looked up, nodded greeting without interrupting his work. Something about his presence felt steady, uncomplicated, not friendship yet, but the foundation friendship might build upon given time. Council this morning, Patroclus mentioned. Agamemnon summons the kings. You're expected. Expected, Achilles repeated, tasting the word's implications. Already they presumed to direct his movements, these older men with their politics and protocols. It's courtesy, not command, Patroclus said mildly, understanding the resistance without requiring it spoken. Though distinctions blur when king's involved. Phoenix says attendance matters. Better to witness decisions than learn of them afterward. Achilles considered this. Phoenix possessed wisdom earned through decades observing how power functioned, how choices made in closed councils rippled outward like stones thrown in still water. I'll go, he decided. But I speak for myself, not for submission to their strategies. They walked together through the waking camp. Cooking fires released smoke that mingled with sea mist, creating atmosphere both ethereal and grounding. Men practiced with weapons, voices raised in competitive encouragement. A boy, perhaps 12 years old, led horses to water, moving with careful concentration that suggested newly granted responsibility. The command tent stood at the harbor's center, larger than others, its fabric dyed deep red that appeared almost black in the morning's uncertain light. Guards flanked the entrance, spears held vertical, faces expressionless beneath bronze helmets. Inside, oil lamps fought against the dimness. The tent smelled of leather, wine, and male bodies crowded too close together. Kings and commanders stood in loose semicircle, some leaning on shields, others sitting on camp stools. Their faces carried weight of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. Agamemnon stood at the center, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing authority like armor. His eyes swept the assembled men, calculating, measuring, assessing. When his gaze found Achilles, something flickered there, recognition perhaps, or evaluation of potential threat. Achilles of fear, Agamemnon acknowledged, son of Peleus. We're honored by your presence. The words held correct formality, but undertones suggested complications. Respect offered, but with reservations already forming. Achilles nodded acknowledgement without warmth. We gather to discuss necessity, Agamemnon continued, addressing the full assembly. 3 weeks we've waited. 3 weeks, while provisions diminish and men grow restless. The seer Calchas has spoken. Artemis demands price for wind. My daughter Iphigenia must come from Mycenae, must stand before the goddess, must offer herself that these ships might sail. Silence followed these words, thick and uncomfortable. Some men studied the ground. Others exchanged glances that communicated volumes without requiring speech. Odysseus, standing to Agamemnon's right, spoke carefully. The goddess's requirements are clear. Without wind, we remain trapped. With wind, we sail toward purpose that brought us here. The choice, if choice it is, seems predetermined. A girl's life, someone muttered from the back. That's the price of favorable weather? A king's daughter, another corrected. not the same calculation. Achilles listened, saying nothing yet, absorbing the atmosphere, the careful politics, the way men justified what they'd already decided must occur. Agamemnon's face remained impassive, but his hands, resting on sword pommel, showed white knuckles. "When does she arrive?" Phoenix asked quietly. "Within 3 days," Agamemnon replied. "Messengers have been sent. She believes she comes for marriage, betrothed to Achilles himself." The words struck like cold water. Achilles straightened, feeling every eye turned toward him. "What?" "The deception seemed necessary," Agamemnon said, not quite meeting his gaze. "A girl wouldn't travel willingly to sacrifice, but marriage to the greatest warrior in Greece? That provides sufficient reason. You invoke my name for deception?" Achilles felt anger rising, controlled but present. "Without consultation, without permission, you use reputation I've earned for purposes I never authorized?" "For Greece," Agamemnon said firmly. "For the alliance. For Troy's fall. Personal concerns become secondary when measured against collective need." "Personal concerns," Achilles repeated slowly. "Honor is personal concern? Truth is secondary consideration?" The tense atmosphere shifted, tension crystallizing. Several kings looked uncomfortable. Odysseus watched with sharp intelligence, evaluating, calculating. Patroclus, standing just behind Achilles, remained perfectly still. "The winds won't blow without sacrifice," Calchas interjected, his voice carrying authority that age and prophecy granted. "This isn't politics, it's divine requirement. Artemis has spoken. We either comply or abandon this entire enterprise." "Then let Agamemnon explain to his daughter why she dies," Achilles said coldly. "Let him speak truth, instead of hiding behind false marriages and borrowed names. My reputation isn't coin he spends without account." Agamemnon's face darkened, but before he could respond, Odysseus raised a hand, diplomatic intervention. "Perhaps we've approached this wrongly," he suggested. "Achilles, no one questions your honor. But understand the situation's complexity. Without wind, everything collapses. With wind purchased through tragedy, we at least move forward." "Forward toward what?" Achilles challenged. "Victory built on daughter's blood? Glory purchased through deception? If these are foundations, perhaps the entire structure deserves questioning." "Idealism," Agamemnon said dismissively. "You're young. You'll learn that righteousness and necessity rarely occupy the same space. Command requires decisions that comfort doesn't permit." "Then command without using my name," Achilles replied. "Face your choices directly, rather than sheltering behind others' reputations." The confrontation hung there, unresolved, as morning light began penetrating the tense fabric, creating red glow that made everything appear stained. Around them, men shifted weight, uncertain whether to intervene or let the conflict develop naturally. Finally, Agamemnon nodded slowly. "Very well. Your name will be withdrawn from the arrangement. The girl comes, believing what she believes. What happens after becomes responsibility I'll bear." He paused, gaze hardening. "But remember this moment, son of Peleus. Remember when ideals confronted reality, and you chose abstract honor over concrete necessity. War teaches harsh lessons. Pray yours arrive gently." The council dispersed slowly, men filing out into daylight that seemed harsh after the tense dimness. Achilles walked away quickly, Patroclus following without need for invitation. They reached the beach where waves rolled in with steady rhythm, eternal and indifferent. Achilles stared across water toward distant Troy, visible now as faint smudge against northeastern horizon. "You made enemy today," Patroclus observed quietly. "Agamemnon doesn't forget challenges to authority." Then he'll remember me clearly, Achilles replied. I didn't sail here to become peace in his political games. If that makes me enemy, so be it. Patroclus sat on nearby rock, picking up smooth stone, turning it over in his hands. Phoenix will say you were right in principle, but foolish in execution. That kings must be managed, not confronted directly. Phoenix teaches caution. Chiron taught truth. Achilles picked up his own stone, throwing it far out into the waves. I know which lesson serves better. They sat together in silence as morning advanced toward noon. Eventually, the wind would blow. The sacrifice would occur, hidden behind whatever justifications necessity provided. Ships would sail toward Troy, carrying men and ambitions and contradictions that no amount of glory could fully resolve. But for now, there was only waiting, and the sound of waves, and the knowledge that choices made in council tents rippled outward in ways no prophecy fully predicted. The day after the council dissolved without resolution, a merchant ship arrived from Mycenae under full sail, cutting through morning mist with purpose that made even idle soldiers stop to watch. It carried no soldiers, no weapons, only passengers whose arrival carried weight that armor could not match. Iphigenia stepped from the ship onto wooden dock, young and bright as spring morning, dressed in traveling cloak that bore purple thread reserved for royal blood. Behind her came attendants and gifts, the elaborate preparation for wedding that would never occur. She scanned the camp with eager eyes, searching for bridegroom she'd been promised. Achilles stood near his tent, sharpening spear that needed no sharpening, watching the arrival with something heavy settling in his chest. Patroclus stood beside him, saying nothing, presence enough. She looks happy, Patroclus observed quietly. She looks deceived, Achilles replied. They watched Agamemnon emerge from the command tent to greet his daughter. The embrace seemed genuine, father holding child who didn't know what dawn would bring. Around them, camp fell unusually quiet. Men who laughed at violence turned away from this particular cruelty, finding sudden interest in mundane tasks that didn't require witnessing. 3 days passed. 3 days of preparation and false celebration, of sacrifice being dressed in wedding garments. Achilles kept to the beach, refusing participation in deception that bore his name, despite his protest. He swam in cold water, practiced with weapons until arms ached, did anything to avoid the elaborate charade unfolding at camp's center. On the 3rd evening, Clytemnestra arrived, Agamemnon's wife and Iphigenia's mother, unexpected and unwelcome. She came with full retinue, prepared to witness daughter's marriage to Greece's greatest warrior. Her arrival complicated everything, forcing Agamemnon to maintain fiction longer than planned, extending cruelty through additional performance. It falls apart, Patroclus said that night as they sat by small fire outside their tent. Too many people, too many lies trying to occupy same space. Truth emerges whether Agamemnon wishes it or not. Achilles poked at fire with stick, watching sparks drift upward into darkness. When it does, blood follows. Not just Iphigenia's. This thing Agamemnon attempts, it breaks bonds between men that shouldn't break. Clytemnestra isn't woman who forgives daughter's murder disguised as divine necessity. No, Patroclus agreed, she isn't. The revelation came at dawn, terrible and inevitable. Someone, never identified, whispered truth to Clytemnestra. Perhaps servant who couldn't bear complicity, perhaps soldier who found conscience in darkness. Origins didn't matter. Effect did. Clytemnestra's scream carried across entire camp, raw sound that held rage and grief in measures that neither could contain alone. Men emerging from tents for morning duties froze, recognizing sound that only betrayal's deepest cut produced. Achilles was already moving, running toward command tent without conscious decision, Patroclus following close behind. They arrived to find chaos, Clytemnestra confronting Agamemnon with fury that made kings seem small, Iphigenia standing between them, understanding dawning across features that had been bright with anticipation mere moments before. You summoned her here to die? Clytemnestra's voice carried accusation that needed no elaboration. Your own daughter, under false pretense of marriage, to satisfy your ambition and appease divine anger, your own hubris created. The winds won't blow without, Agamemnon began. Then let your fleet rot here forever, Clytemnestra spat. Let Troy stand eternal. Let Helen remain with Paris until stones themselves crumble with age. My daughter's blood won't purchase your glory. Iphigenia stood very still, processing information that transformed world from comprehensible to nightmare. She looked at her father, at her mother, then surprisingly toward Achilles, who had entered with crowd now gathering. You, she said quietly. Were you part of this deception? No, Achilles replied firmly. Your father used my name without permission, without knowledge, without honor. I learned of it in council, objected strongly, forced withdrawal of my name from the arrangement. But withdrawal came too late to prevent your journey. Something flickered across Iphigenia's face, gratitude perhaps, or simply recognition that one person in this waking dream maintained truth. She turned back to Agamemnon. Why? Simple question, holding everything. Agamemnon's shoulders sagged slightly, king diminished by daughter's gaze. For Greece. For the alliance. Artemis demands. Artemis demands nothing. Odysseus's voice cut through, unexpected. The king of Ithaca stepped forward from the crowd, face troubled. Or rather, gods demand what priests claim they demand. Calchas interprets signs. Calchas declares requirements. But prophets have been wrong before, and divine will remains conveniently unknowable. Calchas, standing at tent's edge, stiffened. You question Apollo's words spoken through. I question convenient prophecies that serve political purposes, Odysseus interrupted. I question interpretations that demand tragedy when alternatives exist unexplored. The moment hung suspended, entire expedition suddenly balanced on knife's edge. Without wind, everything collapsed. Without sacrifice, wind supposedly remained absent. Without alternative, Agamemnon's choice seemed inevitable. Then Iphigenia spoke, voice carrying unexpected strength. If my death brings wind, I'll go willingly. No. Clytemnestra's response was immediate, absolute. Mother, Iphigenia continued, listen. They came here for Helen, for honor, for alliance. Thousands of men, hundreds of ships, years of preparation. If my life purchases their success, if my blood buys wind that carries them toward purpose, then perhaps death serves meaning larger than my individual existence. Your child, Clytemnestra said desperately. You don't understand what you're offering. I understand I'm going to die, Iphigenia replied with clarity that silenced surrounding men. Whether now for stated purpose, or later when father's failure creates chaos that consumes our entire house. At least this way, death carries meaning. Achilles felt something break inside his chest, watching girl younger than himself accept fate with dignity her father couldn't match. This was courage, real and unadorned, stripped of glory's comfortable distance. There must be another way, he said, not quite knowing why he spoke. Then find it, Iphigenia challenged. Find alternative that satisfies divine anger, produces necessary wind, preserves alliance that's already fracturing from delayed departure. Find it before dawn tomorrow, and I'll embrace life gratefully. But if no alternative exists, she left sentence unfinished, implication clear. The council that formed afterward consumed entire day, desperate men seeking solution that satisfied impossible requirements. But prophecy remained firm, Artemis's anger allegedly specific, and alternatives dissolved under scrutiny that found each wanting. Evening came, decision hardening toward inevitability. Iphigenia spent final hours with her mother, quiet conversation that no one disturbed. Agamemnon sat alone in command tent, making acquaintance with choice's full weight. Achilles walked the beach as sun descended, Patroclus beside him in companionable silence that needed no words. Waves rolled steadily, eternal rhythm, indifferent to human tragedy unfolding nearby. "Tomorrow we sail," Patroclus said eventually. "Wind or no wind, something breaks at dawn." "Yes," Achilles agreed. "And whatever glory waits at Troy, it's already stained before we arrive." That's what Agamemnon doesn't understand. Victory purchased through certain prices becomes indistinguishable from defeat. They stood together as darkness gathered, watching stars emerge one by one above water that led toward distant Troy. Somewhere in that darkness, fate waited with patient certainty, prepared to collect what prophecy had always promised. But tonight there was only waiting, and the sound of waves, and the knowledge that morning would bring choices no amount of courage could make honorable. Dawn arrived with mist hanging low across the water, turning world into something uncertain and ghostly. Ships emerged from grey half-light like memories materializing, their masts dark lines against pale sky. Men moved through camp with unusual quietness, armor muffled, conversations conducted in whispers. Even those who supported the decision seemed reluctant to break the heavy silence with unnecessary sound. Achilles stood near the water's edge, watching morning resolve itself into terrible clarity. Beside him, Patroclus maintained steady presence, understanding that some moments required nothing beyond companionship. The altar had been built during night, white stone carried up from beach and arranged with precision that suggested ritual older than any present could remember. Calchas moved around it now, arranging implements with careful hands, preparing space where human met divine, where blood purchased wind, where sacrifice transformed into something priests called necessary. Iphigenia emerged from her mother's tent wearing white, the color of weddings and offerings, of purity and endings. Her hair had been arranged with flowers, delicate blooms that would wither before sunset. She walked without hesitation, each step carrying weight of choice made in darkness and maintained through dawn. Clytemnestra followed at distance, face like carved marble, all grief compressed into expression that would never quite leave her features. She held herself with rigid control, queen maintaining dignity even as mother's heart shattered into pieces no time would fully mend. Agamemnon waited at altar, wearing his finest armor, as though meeting this moment as king rather than father might make it bearable. But his hand shook slightly when Iphigenia approached, and his face had aged years overnight. "Father," she said simply, voice carrying across assembled men with unexpected strength. "Daughter," he replied, word breaking slightly. She reached up, touched his bearded cheek with gentle fingers. "Remember, this was my choice. In the end, I walked here freely." Whether this was mercy or reproach, no one could quite determine. Perhaps it was both, final gift from daughter to father who would carry this morning until his own blood stained different stones in different story. Achilles watched from his position, feeling something fundamental shift inside his understanding. This was what glory cost, what honor demanded, what prophecy extracted from those caught in its machinery. Not the clean death of battle where warriors fell among equals, but this quiet horror where innocent became currency, where children purchased victories they would never witness. Calchas began his invocation, words older than Troy, older than Greece, perhaps older than gods themselves. The language of sacrifice transcended specific deities, touching something primal about how humans understood the world and their place within its vast indifference. Iphigenia knelt before altar with steady grace. She did not weep, did not plead, did not look toward mother standing rigid at gathering's edge. Her eyes remained fixed on horizon where Troy waited unknowing, where Helen lived her captivity, or perhaps her choice, where men would soon die in numbers that made this morning seem like small tragedy in comparison. The knife caught morning light, bronze flashing once before descending. What happened next, accounts would later disagree. Some claimed Artemis took pity, substituted deer at final moment, transported girl to distant sanctuary where she would serve as priestess for remaining days. Others insisted sacrifice completed as planned, blood-soaking white stone, wind rising immediately from the death. Achilles never spoke of what he witnessed, maintaining silence that suggested certain knowledge transcended public telling. But something changed in his eyes that morning, some final innocence burning away like mist under sun's examination. What remained undisputed was that wind came. Suddenly, powerfully, from exactly the direction needed to fill Greek sails and carry ships toward Troy. It arrived with almost supernatural precision, as though world itself had been waiting for precisely this moment to exhale. Men rushed to their vessels, grateful for activity that prevented contemplation. Sails were raised, ropes secured, anchors lifted from mud that had held them captive for weeks. The expedition that had seemed impossible yesterday moved with sudden efficiency, 1,000 ships preparing to transform from dream into reality. Achilles boarded his vessel slowly, Patroclus already aboard, myrmidons moving with practiced coordination that required no supervision. He stood at prow as ship caught wind, watching Aulis recede behind them, altar visible for long moment before distance transformed it into abstract mark against shoreline. Clytemnestra remained on beach, solitary figure watching fleet depart. Even from increasing distance, her stillness communicated everything about grief that found no adequate expression. She would return to Mycenae changed, would wait years for husband's return, would remember this morning when making her own choices about justice, mercy, and what wives owed to kings who sacrificed their children for wind. The crossing began under clear sky, wind steady and favorable, as though God, satisfied by offering, now provided everything requested. Ships spread across water like scattered leaves, each carrying men toward destiny that would consume them in ways both predicted and utterly unexpected. Achilles felt prophecy settling around him like comfortable weight. Thetis had warned him, offered choice that seemed simple in abstract, long, quiet life, or brief, glorious one. He had chosen glory, understanding it in terms of battle, victory, songs sung by future generations. But glory's true price revealed itself now, standing on deck with Iphigenia's final grace remembered, with Agamemnon's compromise witnessed, with understanding that the war ahead would demand not just courage, but constant negotiation with honor's complicated requirements. Patroclus appeared beside him, two friends standing together as they had countless times, as they would countless times more, until friendship itself became casualty of choices not yet made. Thinking about turning back? Patroclus asked lightly. Too late for that, Achilles replied. Wind carries us forward whether we wish it or not. Convenient excuse, Patroclus observed, blaming wind for choices. Achilles smiled slightly, recognizing truth in his friend's gentle mockery. You're right. I chose this. Chose it knowing cost, knowing price, knowing that glory purchased through such mournings becomes indistinguishable from its opposite, and yet you chose it anyway. And yet I chose it anyway, Achilles confirmed. They stood together watching water pass beneath ship's wooden hull, watching Troy's distant shore gradually resolve itself from rumor into geographical certainty. Somewhere ahead waited everything prophecy promised, battles that would echo through generations, friendships tested beyond endurance, love and death intertwined so completely that separating them became impossible, and finally, inevitably, the arrow that would find his heel. But that remained ahead, still potential rather than actual, still future rather than past. For now, there was only this. Wind filling sails, water stretching toward horizon, and the knowledge that choice once made carried men forward into whatever waited, glory and horror mixed together until distinguishing between them became meaningless. The ships sailed on toward Troy, 1,000 vessels carrying 1,000 dreams toward single destiny. And if any among them paused to wonder whether glory justified its cost, whether honor survived the compromises required to achieve it, whether prophecies deserved fulfillment rather than resistance, they kept such questions private, locked away with all the other doubts that warriors learned to carry silently. For those who find peace in these ancient stories, who drift towards sleep on the rhythm of old choices and older consequences, perhaps you'll return to Olympus Dreams for more such journeys. A like or subscription helps others discover these pathways to rest, these mythological roads that lead away from the present moment toward sleep's welcoming shore. Behind them, Aulis disappeared entirely, become memory rather than place, become story rather than geography. And ahead, Troy waited with patient certainty, towers rising against eastern sky, walls that would stand for 10 long years before finally falling to Greek cunning and Trojan sorrow. But tonight, rest comes not from resolution, but from the eternal rhythm of waves, from the knowledge that even the mightiest heroes were once simply men standing on ships, sailing toward destinies they could not avoid, and perhaps in the end would not have chosen to escape.